Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by the wise and venerable Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you on this freezing cold day?
Cold.
Yes. And of course, the illustrious Mr. Herman Pretorius. Herman, how are you?
Well, I must say, when you started with wise, I knew that the intro was going to Terence first, so then I could relax a moment. But I must say that I think it's very reflective of realities that Terence just cut to the chase. How are you cold? That's a factual statement. It's analysis. It rings true. I had to go on a whole little spiel and reveal far too much about my, personal anxieties and stuff. But here we are. I'm also cold, but I reached that point through, just a meltdown.
Let's let it never be said that Herman cannot fill time. Obviously, he's got a barking dog in the background.
Yeah,
I didn't know you had a dog.
It's my landlord's dog. Give me a second. I'll be with you in a moment.
All right. So while Herman goes away, let us start with our first story, which is the government of Nigeria has suspended Twitter in the country with, I believe, immediate effect. So on Saturday, the government ordered the telecommunications operators of Nigeria to enforce an indefinite suspension of Twitter's platform in Nigeria. The Nigerian government said it was indefinitely suspending Twitter because they deleted a tweet by the president of Nigeria, Muhammadu Buhari, after he said there were some attacks by Biafran separatists on police and government buildings in the area of Biafra, southeast Nigeria. And the president tweeted that he would respond to the separatists in, quote, a language that they understand. Treat them in a language that they understand, which I think is fairly clearly sort of a call to violence. Twitter said that his tweet was abusive and dangerous and that they were going to delete it. The president criticized Twitter, saying the mission of Twitter in Nigeria is very suspicious, and that Twitter had in the past ignored tweets inciting violence against the Nigerian government, he said. They said that they were suspending Twitter to protect Nigeria's existence as a corporate entity. So just a little bit of background on this and why it's such a hot button issue for Nigeria. Between 1967 and 1970, there was a civil war when the southeastern Nigeria, mostly the ethnic group known as the Igbo, attempted to break away to create a country called Biafra. And more than 1 million people died in that conflict. And it's still, I think, an issue in Nigeria today. So Terence, a lot of people, when Trump was getting banned and harassed by Twitter for statements he had made, there was a lot of sentiment out there that Twitter was being very selective and just kind of targeting certain people. So I see from Nigeria's government we're seeing a similar line of attack on them, but it does look like Twitter is kind of rolling out their net of bannable offenses to more and more world leaders. What do you make of this? What do you make of Twitter's move?
Well, it seems that they didn't ban the Nigerian government or the Nigerian president from tweeting. They deleted a tweet. In the case of Trump, as I understand it, they banned the person.
Yeah, they initially started with flagging his tweets, and then they forced him to delete something, and then they banned him.
Right. Look, my view is that Twitter contributes very little that is positive to political debate. It's one of the reasons why I'm not on Twitter, and why, please put me down painlessly if I ever am tempted to do so. But if Twitter is going to go this route, it needs to be absolutely consistent and even-handed. And this was, of course, the issue that was raised with Trump. I remember there were these lists of comparable tweets doing the round. I think one from some senior person in the Iranian government about how they intended to wipe Israel off the face of the map, etc., etc., etc. So, to avoid the perception or indeed the reality of bias, you have to be very careful about what you do and make sure that that is how you are applying it to all. In Nigeria's case, yeah, look, the Biafran thing is a remarkably sensitive issue. It's they actually changed their national anthem after the war, because the sort of independence version said something about tongue and tribe may differ, and after the Biafran War, that particular line was excised. There's a very strong sense amongst the people from the Biafran area and from their descendants that the Nigerian state has never properly accounted for its conduct there. I mean, it was a vicious war. Not only people dying in combat, but a famine that went through, epidemics, that sort of thing. That they were cut off. Also, some very intriguing alliances. I think both Tanzania and South Africa supported the Biafrans. I think both the Americans and the Soviets supported the Nigerians. Strange bedfellows. If you go online, you can find all sorts of websites dedicated to this. Online memorials to compensate for the physical memorials that were never put up. But one could, I think, throw back at the Nigerian president, whether his conduct does not, his words do not perhaps feed exactly what he's accused Twitter of.
So, Herman, let me go to you. I think this is something we're starting to see more and more, particularly sort of authoritarian-leaning governments, as Nigeria is unfortunately banning social media, restricting internet access. We've seen this in Iran when there's periods of protest. We're seeing this obviously in China. What do you make of all of this?
I think we've even seen it in Zimbabwe, if I'm not much mistaken, in December 2017 with a coup that was not a coup. The coup that was so much not a coup that the military had to come on air on the state broadcaster saying this is not a coup. I mean, if you're looking for irony, you'll find it in the 21st century in abundance. But I think the dangerous thing for me here is I don't believe human nature has changed much since time immemorial, but something that has changed, that is new, is social media, and especially things like Twitter and Facebook. Because in the past, when a piece of technology was used to generate a piece of information, that piece of information would go out into the world, and the technology responsible for its creation was no longer able to retract that piece of information. Gutenberg couldn't say, "Oh, you've put my press to awful uses that I don't agree with, so now I retrospectively take your publication out of existence." That's something quite new, is that we have these platforms of information, but that they are not traditionally the use of technology and then the message goes out. There's this continued involvement of very, very powerful corporations. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad or a good thing, but I do think it is something for us to think about in a new way, because the problem for Twitter and Facebook and Google and those kind of people is if they are going to start behaving editorially, they must be aware of the fact that that opens them up to consequences for dodgy or untoward editorial decisions. It's quite a dangerous thing. If they were to be pure on the one side, saying we're not going to become involved editorially with the content, in only very clear, delineated cases where there are calls to active violence or something like that, we will act and boot someone from our platform. That would have protected them to a certain degree were the information published on their platforms to cause harm later on. But now that they've strayed beyond that purer position into this sort of gray area of subjective judgment calls, where one can say there might be an agenda, they are opening themselves up from a legal standpoint, I think, to something quite dangerous. If you're going to say you're an editor with editorial insight, then you're going to be held to a different standard. And whether the Nigerian president is right or not in the sense that Twitter has an agenda, the fact is that the mere allegation being believable is a problem for Twitter, because that means they've lost this idea of just a platform of information. And just generally speaking, I think it's a bad idea for information to be censored in this way. However, it is a private company, and I'm not quite sure yet how I feel on those 2 points of tension. So yeah, I must say it's a dangerous precedent, but of all the dangers, I think the one considered least is for the platform themselves.
I must say, I agree with the general negative perception of Twitter and its uses to the body politic, particularly to journalists. And yet, seeing it banned sends chills down my spine. Terence, any thoughts on this can of worms that Herman has just talked about, that Twitter may have opened for themselves before we move on?
Just to say that these social media companies, they are private companies, but they're providing a sort of, as Moffman said, a virtual public square. This is something that we don't have much experience of. And I think this is going to be an intriguing source of controversy for a long time to come.
Well said. Right.
Because Nick, if I might just add something on that, is a while ago with Netflix and the banning of what is Cuties, or some sort of film that was perceived to sexualize prepubescent girls. And people then boycotted them or canceled their subscriptions, and Netflix said, no, this is content, artistic freedom, we're keeping it up. It's bad phraseology in that context, Herman, but I must say the challenge is, to a certain extent, where do you draw the line of these tech giants? Because I think it's quite disgusting to keep something like Cuties or whatever it is online. I saw some material of it, and it didn't sit well. But so it is a question that we as a society globally and locally will have to face up to in some ways, because there are points on both sides we need to answer satisfactorily.
Indeed. All right, let's move on to our next story for today. And that is a rather interesting story that I think is a good news story, and perhaps a sign of how things may go in the future of South Africa if government doesn't get in the way. So there was a story on Independent Online about the Shoprite group. So these are, of course, the shopping centers, the grocery markets around the country. They set up last year a in-house team, a security team, operating from a centralized command center that was set up to basically help contain crime around their stores. They believe that they have managed to reduce crime around their stores by 16% from July 2020 to May 2021. This team that they set up is involved in the entire process. They identify suspects. So this is, I presume, mostly armed robbers and shoplifters and those kinds. They identify the suspects. They go to court to oppose bail. They work with the police to ensure they have a complete and accurate docket, because, of course, we all know about dockets going missing in criminal cases. And then they work with the National Prosecuting Authority to provide evidence in court to make sure that criminals go away. Shoprite is claiming that their security team has basically managed to secure the convictions of 200 people for a cumulative jail time of something like 300 years altogether. So it's a little over one year per person arrested, basically, on average. This is quite fascinating to me, because it suggests that that there's actually space in the country for a private police force. And this is the inevitable result of the police being so weak. I'll just go on a little tangent here. Someone I know is opening an intimidation case with the police, and they have video of it. And the police are not able to take the video because the officer who's been assigned to basically deal with the case, has not been given any data or any Wi-Fi, and so literally can't download the video because he can't afford it. And so he's trying to do the whole thing on paper. And that's fairly typical of how things go in the South African police service. So that, here's a police officer who's trying, but he's completely without resources. So it's no surprise to me that the private sector is kind of walking in to fill this gap. Herman, your thoughts on this development, and do you think it's a good thing for the country?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something. Anything that fights crime, I'm willing to entertain. I think this just makes the point why decentralization of power is really good, because at its best, it puts power and decision-making authority in the hands of people who have skin in the game. And I think if there's one thing that South Africa has struggled with since the union in 1910 is this idea of skin in the game. For the first how many years, white South African governments could govern as they wish without really any consequences from those they are not treating well, because there was no skin in the game with regards to black interests in the country. And then after 1994, with a brief possible interlude there, the PR system, the proportional representation system, where you get a seat in parliament if you please the party bosses enough, and the electorate couldn't care, or your relationship with the electorate couldn't matter less. We also have a political system where the total absence of skin in the game is really part of the problem. Now, this with Shoprite coming to do this, firstly, I think it's the natural evolution of a state failing so fundamentally. We already are in a situation where we have 5 private security officers for each policeman in the national police force. So we're already solidly down the road of privatizing at least, individual or small level community safety, street by street almost. But the fact that corporate entities are now stepping into this vacuum is, I think, very, very interesting. And I say 2020 wasn't a great year, but it was a good year on 2 fronts, and 2 small fronts, but things that I think can become quite significant. Firstly, it was the Geteleng River municipality that the court found the ratepayers can, as it were, privatize the municipal services with regards to water in that town, that where failure is so significant, the municipality can be excluded, and then the ratepayers can get compensation through later claims, if I remember correctly. So that's the one thing. The other thing was the door opening inch by inch, or even nanomillimeter by nanomillimeter, for corporate entities like Amazon and so on to get into the business of independent power provision for their own purposes, not to sell back onto the grid, because that's a whole other thing I accept. But if we take those 2 policy developments into account, and you take something like this into account, there's a very solid case building, and if we can build it successfully, I think it can be quite something. Very solid case building for the private sector or individuals to step up and say, government has a mandate here, it has failed, therefore I legitimately have the right to act in this and this and this way, and the government cannot act against me, or I can find the necessary compensation or some form of recompense from the state. So I must say all of this is very broadly positive, because it takes power away from an out-of-touch elite. It puts it there where there's skin in the game, and if handled correctly, the South African citizenry can use this sort of thing as the wedge that finally brings some sort of fracture in the status quo of an out-of-touch political elite and a failing country. So, yes, that's what I have to say.
So I think that this really does show that, South Africans are actually, despite the many problems that we have, everything from poverty to the bad education system to whatever, we're pretty good at, and of course the obstructive government, we're pretty good at finding ways around problems and doing stuff to make sure that things work.
In fact, Nick, can I quickly jump in there? Walter E. Williams, the Black American economist, made this point in a 1981 publication, I think, where he said Black employers, white employers in apartheid South Africa, continually found loopholes to hire black people in their businesses, and the state had to chase up and cover up these loopholes through sheer obstructionism. So this thing about South Africans being pretty good at problem solving as long as the state isn't in the way with some poisonous ideology, I mean, that's one of the countervailing forces I hope hasn't died out yet and we can harness going forward.
Right, exactly. What's also quite interesting is this apparently is mostly ex-police officers. And from the sounds of the reporting, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but it seems like these guys are kind of still operating quite tightly within the law. This isn't a sort of fly-by-night vigilante operation where a bunch of guys are driving around beating up people. So Terence, let me go to you. What do you make of this development?
Well, I agree broadly with what Herman says. Unfortunately, we've been bleeding skills from the police for decades. I remember actually speaking to a prosecutor probably about 1997 who said that a big problem that they were having with commercial cases, fraud, that sort of thing, is that many of the people who had experience in that were disappearing into working for banks and there are also issues about the incentives that the police service offers to its people to upskill themselves, automatic progression and that sort of thing, which unfortunately I think keeps a lot of deadwood there. I was once told that the average police officer in the UK would work in the organization for 10 years. Anybody who stayed beyond that has proven themselves, and they go on to be sergeants and inspectors and commissioners and whatever. So you have, but you have the sort of these new cadres coming through constantly. They work professionally, but then they see that they don't quite cut the mustard to advance. We, as I think a lot of state institutions, seem to treat this as to some extent as an extended welfare system, and this is not to take away from the fact that police do a very dangerous job, and many, probably most, do the best they can under very trying circumstances. Where I would disagree with Herman, or perhaps take a different alt, is that I think that citizens taking charge of power generation or water or whatever is one thing. I do not believe that the state will ever surrender its monopoly on policing. I think there is simply too much paranoia there. I think that before the government concedes that it is unable to fulfill that function, it would rather close down every private security firm in the country.
I think that's probably correct.
That is just not going to happen. I will bet my life savings, all 33 cents of it, with Herman that never happens.
So I think that is broadly true, and you can see some hints of that in the way that, for example, the ANC banned foreign ownership of private security companies, precisely because I think they're scared of, they sometimes talk about the CIA being in plots to get rid of the ANC government. I wouldn't be surprised if the ANC put those laws in specifically because they feared the CIA overthrowing them, which is not very likely.
Well, actually go back to the 1990s. Nelson Mandela's infamous speech at the Mafeking Congress. I think there's actually a reference to private security in there. Now, as I say, look, a lot of this is pure paranoia, but it's paranoia that's driven by a number of factors, including venality and corruption, including ideology.
I can't remember who was it, but it was a member of parliament who said to me once that they were in the parliamentary committee, discussing the expenditure on the arms deal. And why do we need to buy, these sort of weaponry? And then the response from an ANC member of parliament was legitimately, did you not see what has just happened in Afghanistan and in Iraq? Bush might invade.
Right. That's a pretty. I've said it before.
Actually, I remember that quote. I think that was actually from the Minister of Health. I think the context was, why can we not buy antiretrovirals, but we can buy these submarines that don't work and planes that don't have missiles and whatever? And it was, to fend off the impending American invasion. Yeah, look, as I say, we bought planes that had no weapon systems. So if that's your concern,
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Go listen to the ANC in Parliament. It's very illuminating about how they think on the world. Right, so we must very briefly move on. We don't have much time. To our final story for today, which is something I think most of our listeners probably have some idea of, but it's quite interesting nonetheless, which is how poorly equipped South Africa's army is in. So this is from a piece written by Helmut Heitmann, where he says that, this is quoting him, the South African army is not in as desperate straits as the Navy, but it does face some real challenges. The most obvious one is the age of its main equipment. The Army's Olifant II tanks were upgraded in the 1990s from Centurions, which were built in the 1950s. The Ratel infantry combat vehicles, the Casper armored personnel carriers, the 150mm G5 guns all date from the late 70s and 80s, as do the Samel trucks and the Woykat armored cars. And the G6 self-propelled guns date from the 1990s, as does the more modern field engineer equipment. So basically, everything is 20, 30, 40 years old or older. I mean, our tanks are based on, the 1950s tanks. And with looming crises in the region, particularly in northern Mozambique, we kind of need our army more than ever, especially if they're going to try and prevent that chaos from spreading south. Terence, what do you make of this?
Well, I thought the other illuminating thing in that was they said the average age of a soldier is 37 years old. You don't have this is not unique to South Africa, but when that is your average age, you don't have an army, you have a pension scheme. This is also something that has been that's been observed in countries like Belgium. Aging armies, I think at one stage their average age was 42. So we're spring chickens by comparison. But the point is, you don't have a combat worthy army. And my view on that is that either you have an army that you can actually put into the field that is in a position to fight, to win, and is going to take casualties, or you don't have an army at all. Now, option 2 is quite legitimate. The Costa Ricans apparently do that. They reckon that they're a zone of peace and whatever, and they have sort of paramilitary border guards. If that's your bag, then that's your bag. But if you actually want a combat-worthy force that can take on Islamist militias in northern Mozambique, there's a certain portfolio of things you need: helicopters, transport aircraft, special forces, people who are at the peak of fitness, pilots and that sort of thing that can get you in and get you out. If you're not prepared to actually put those resources on the table, then I would say rather take it away. We've seen some appalling behavior from our army over the years. When they marched on the Union buildings and jump the fence. Now, if this had been Chile in the 1970s, there's a word you would have used that starts with C and it ends with U. The way that some of our military behaved during the lockdown. Don't let people disrespect you. Someone was checking me a skiff and drinking a beer on his porch, so obviously we had to club him to death. I liken this to firearm ownership. And this is maybe something that our government, which now wants to confiscate your guns, I can understand. With this comes with great responsibility. If you can't handle your army responsibly, don't have it.
Mm-hmm. Herman, we don't have a lot of time, but your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I must say I agree with Terence on that. The terrifying thing is that the military structure is weak in several ways. Firstly, it's weak in discipline, it's weak in the chain of command, and it's badly equipped and it's badly trained. So I must say it's an all-around quite a problematic situation for the army to be in. But I must say, I think the one area where they must be brilliant at is camouflage, because I was told a year ago that we would be seeing about 75,000 soldiers on the streets. I never saw one of them. Their camo tactics and equipment must be extraordinary.
Well, apparently there were enough of them to be involved in the killing of Collins Causa. So there were somewhere. But anyway, that is a story that I think we've covered before, and hopefully we've not heard the end of yet. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We will be back with you tomorrow for another episode of The Daily Friend. Please check out our Saturday special edition, which was hosted by Amy Claire Morton, talking about firearms with the head of Girls on Fire. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful day.